He thought humiliating her would make him look powerful on camera, but he had no idea he was about to hand her the spotlight he worshipped. The private dining room of Whitmore and Ash glowed under warm Edison bulbs, copper pans hanging like trophies behind the open kitchen, cameras mounted discreetly in the corners for the evening's investor livestream. Chef Daniel Whitmore stood at the center of it all in a crisp white jacket stitched with his name in navy thread, his posture straight, his voice smooth and practiced as he addressed a table of potential backers seated beneath crystal glassware and $300 plate tasting menus. "In my kitchen," he said with a faint smile, "precision is everything. Hierarchy matters." Just a few feet away, Emily Carter adjusted a tray near the expo station, her black apron simple, her hair tied back in a low bun, her presence quiet enough to disappear between the steam and stainless steel. To the investors, she looked like any other temporary staff member filling in for the weekend rush, someone hired to refill water glasses and clear porcelain plates without being noticed. Daniel barely glanced at her when she subtly repositioned a garnish on a dish before it left the pass, a tiny adjustment of microgreens measured in fractions of an inch. But he saw it, and he didn't like it. The investors murmured approvingly as servers carried out the first course, a truffle-laced risotto plated with architectural precision. One of the guests, a tech executive from Palo Alto, took a bite and hesitated just long enough for the cameras to catch it. Daniel noticed. He always noticed. The air shifted slightly, the way it does before a summer storm rolls over Manhattan. Daniel stepped closer to the table, his smile tightening. "Perhaps," he said, loud enough for the live-stream microphones to capture every word, "we need to remind everyone what excellence actually looks like." His eyes drifted back toward Emily. "You," he called, not bothering to use her name. The room quieted. Investors leaned back in their chairs. A line cook paused mid-chop. "Since you seemed confident enough to adjust my plating," Daniel continued, voice smooth but edged with challenge, "why don't you step in and prepare the Emperor's Flame?" A few staff members exchanged uneasy glances. The Emperor's Flame wasn't just any dish. It was Daniel's signature, a notoriously complex creation balancing dry-aged duck, black garlic reduction, and a controlled flambe finish time to the second. Even seasoned sous chefs had faltered under its pressure. Emily's hands stilled for a fraction of a second, then she set the tray down carefully. "Medium rare?" she asked softly. Daniel gave a thin laugh. "Cook it exactly as written." The investors watched with polite curiosity, unaware they were witnessing something far more consequential than a kitchen stunt. Daniel stepped aside with theatrical generosity, gesturing toward the stove as if offering mercy. What he didn't see, what none of them saw, was the way Emily's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, her shoulders settling, her breathing steadying, her eyes focusing not with fear, but with familiarity. The cameras continued streaming. The copper pans reflected the overhead light. And in that gleaming kitchen, under the hum of refrigeration units and the faint clink of silverware, a quiet reversal had already begun. Emily stepped to the stainless steel counter without haste, tying her apron strings a fraction tighter, as if preparing for nothing more than another shift. The livestream indicator glowed red in the corner of the room, unnoticed by most, but impossible to ignore if you understood what it meant. Investors leaned forward, forks paused midair, expecting awkwardness, expecting hesitation, expecting proof that hierarchy existed for a reason. Daniel folded his arms across his chest, positioning himself where both the guests and the cameras could see his profile. "The duck is dry-aged for 48 hours, he announced coolly, as though narrating a master class. "Score the skin precisely 1/4 inch apart. No deeper." Emily nodded once. Her fingers brushed the duck breast, testing the firmness, the temperature, the subtle give beneath the skin. She reached for a chef's knife, not the one set out for prep, but another from the magnetic strip, weighing it in her palm for balance. The blade moved with quiet certainty, each cut evenly spaced, each line identical, not rushed, not exaggerated. The kitchen sound softened. The hiss of burners seemed to lower in volume. A sous chef stopped stirring and simply watched. Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Emily placed the duck skin side down in a cold cast-iron pan, allowing the fat to render slowly as the heat climbed, a technique that required patience and absolute control. No splatter, no flare of drama, only steady transformation. She reached for black garlic cloves, pressing them with the side of the knife into a smooth paste before folding them into a reduction that had been simmering too aggressively moments before. With one small adjustment of the flame, she restored its silkiness. One of the investors exchanged a glance with another, eyebrows lifting. Daniel shifted his weight. "Do not overthink it," he said, though his voice lacked its earlier ease. Emily did not respond. She moved to the oven, checking the internal temperature with a thermometer she calibrated instinctively, stopping at 128 degrees Fahrenheit before letting carryover heat finish the job. The timing was exact. She prepared the flambé component with measured restraint, warming the cognac just enough to release aroma without spectacle. When the flame rose, it was controlled, deliberate, extinguished within seconds, leaving behind a subtle caramelized glaze rather than theatrics. The copper pans reflected the movement of fire like a brief sunrise and then returned to stillness. Daniel's expression shifted from amusement to something closer to calculation. He recognized the sequencing now, the discipline, the restraint that only years of mastery could produce. Emily plated with steady hands, slicing the duck into perfect medallions, arranging them with negative space that spoke louder than decoration. She wiped the rim of the plate once, precisely, then stepped back half a pace. No flourish, no announcement, just quiet completion. The room did not erupt. It did something far more powerful. It fell silent. Daniel did not move at first. He stared at the plate as if it were a puzzle assembled without his permission. The investors waited, unsure whether they were witnessing a clever demonstration or the beginning of something else. Emily lifted the dish and carried it to the head of the table with the same calm efficiency she had shown when refilling water glasses earlier that evening. She placed it before the Palo Alto executive without a word. The man studied the presentation, the clean lines of the sliced duck, the deep mahogany glaze catching the light, the black garlic reduction resting like ink against porcelain. He cut into it slowly. The knife met no resistance. A thin ribbon of steam rose into the air. He tasted it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then his eyebrows lifted, not dramatically, but with unmistakable surprise. He chewed thoughtfully, then took another bite before setting down his fork. "The balance," he said carefully, as if choosing his words with precision, "is remarkable. The sweetness does not overpower the acidity. The skin is crisp without being brittle." His gaze shifted toward Daniel, then back to Emily. "This is exceptional." A low murmur spread around the table as other investors leaned in, asking for a taste. Plates were discreetly requested, forks passed across white linen. Each reaction followed the same pattern. Silence, concentration, then approval that was no longer polite, but genuine. In the kitchen, one of the junior cooks whispered under his breath, "That is not beginner technique." Daniel stepped forward finally, reaching for a fork himself. He sampled the duck, his expression controlled, but the calculation behind his eyes intensified. He recognized the rendering method, the restraint in seasoning, the deliberate decision to lower the reduction's heat before it broke. These were not lucky choices. They were decisions made by someone who understood not only flavor, but consequence. "Interesting interpretation," Daniel said at last, though the word interpretation felt smaller than the truth. Emily met his gaze evenly. "It is your recipe," she replied softly. "I only followed its intention." The live stream cameras captured every angle, the investors now speaking more animatedly, some asking who she had trained under, others wondering aloud why they had not heard her name before. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but before he could shape the narrative, one of the older investors, a hospitality group chairman from Chicago, leaned forward in his chair and looked at Emily with narrowed eyes. Recognition dawned slowly across his features. "I know you," he said, his voice no longer casual. The room stilled again, this time with a different weight. He set his napkin down deliberately. "You were at Lorraine in Chicago 3 years ago, the youngest executive chef in the state to earn a Michelin star." A faint flicker crossed Daniel's face. Not disbelief. Understanding. The chairman continued, almost to himself. "You left right after the awards ceremony. No interviews. No farewell." All eyes turned to Emily. She did not smile. She did not deny it. She simply stood there, hands folded lightly in front of her apron, as the truth settled over the room like a final course no one had anticipated. The silence did not break immediately. It deepened. The chairman from Chicago kept his eyes on Emily, as if confirming a memory that refused to fade. Around the table, phones subtly shifted, some guests discreetly searching her name beneath the linen. Within seconds, a photograph from 3 years ago surfaced on one of the screens, a younger version of Emily standing beneath bright stage lights, holding a Michelin plaque with the same calm expression she wore now. A quiet ripple moved through the room. Daniel felt it before he fully understood it. Reputation, in his world, was currency measured more carefully than dollars. And in a single breath, the balance had shifted. "Why would you be here?" Daniel asked, his tone controlled but stripped of its earlier amusement. It was no longer a challenge. It was a question edged with something closer to unease. Emily's gaze remained steady. "Because I applied for a position," she replied simply. "Your restaurant needed weekend support." The answer landed heavier than any accusation could have. Daniel searched her face for sarcasm, for arrogance, for any sign that she was enjoying the reversal. He found none. Only composure. One of the investors leaned back in his chair, folding his hands thoughtfully. "Chef Whitmore," he said carefully, "you never mentioned that your staff included talent of this caliber." Daniel's jaw tightened again, but this time there was no quick recovery, no polished line ready for delivery. The live stream camera continued its quiet recording, capturing the subtle shifts in posture, the investors who were now looking at Emily with curiosity rather than dismissal. Emily spoke before Daniel could reclaim control. "I left Chicago because I was tired," she said softly, not to defend herself, but to explain. "Not tired of cooking. Tired of kitchens where ego mattered more than the food." The words were calm, almost reflective, yet they echoed against the copper and steel with unmistakable clarity. Daniel inhaled slowly. He remembered the moment earlier that evening when he had declared that hierarchy mattered. He remembered the deliberate tone, the performance for the investors. Now that same declaration hovered in the air, exposed. The chairman from Chicago gave a small nod, as though a private conclusion had been reached. "Talent does not disappear," he said. "It waits." A junior server near the pass whispered to another, the tension no longer rooted in embarrassment but in revelation. Daniel stepped forward at last, no longer performing, no longer projecting dominance. He studied Emily the way he might study a rival chef's technique, searching for flaws. There were none visible. Only discipline. Only restraint. "Why did you not say who you were?" he asked quietly. Emily answered without hesitation. "Because I wanted to see what kind of kitchen this was." The words did not accuse. They did not demand. They simply existed. And in that moment, under the warm glow of Edison bulbs and the silent gaze of investors who now understood far more than they had an hour ago, the hierarchy Daniel had spoken about began to look less like leadership and more like insecurity. No one reached for applause. No one filled the silence with polite laughter. The room held still, as if waiting to see whether humility would finally enter the menu. Daniel felt every pair of eyes in the room waiting for him to respond, not as a performer now, but as a leader. The investors were no longer studying the plating or the wine pairing. They were studying him. The live stream camera remained fixed, silent, and impartial, capturing the subtle tremor in authority that no script could disguise. He drew in a measured breath, smoothing the front of his jacket as if resetting the moment. "Whitmore and Ash was built on excellence," he said carefully, though the sharp edge had softened. "We value talent wherever it is found." The words sounded rehearsed even to him. Emily did not challenge the statement. She simply stood with quiet patience, her hands resting lightly against the apron she had worn like armor. One of the investors, a woman from a New York hospitality group, leaned forward. "Then perhaps excellence should not have to prove itself through humiliation," she said gently, not accusatory, but firm. The sentence landed with more weight than any raised voice could have carried. A sous chef at the far end of the pass lowered his eyes. Daniel glanced around his own kitchen, seeing it not as a stage but as a reflection. The copper pans, the marble countertops, the precise lighting, all of it designed to project control. Yet control had slipped not through rebellion, but through grace. Emily spoke again, her tone calm, almost reflective. "A kitchen can be demanding without being dismissive. Precision does not require pride." No one interrupted her. There was no need. The truth of it settled naturally. Daniel stepped closer to the center island where the emperor's flame had been prepared. He looked at the empty pan, the rendered fat glistening faintly under the lights, the thermometer resting exactly where she had left it. Every movement she had made had been deliberate, not to outshine him, not to embarrass him, but to honor the dish itself. That realization carried more sting than public embarrassment ever could. The chairman from Chicago rose slowly from his seat. "Chef Whitmore," he said with composed authority, "your restaurant has potential. But potential is not measured only by flavor. It is measured by culture." The word culture echoed through the space. Daniel nodded once, not defensively, but thoughtfully. He turned toward Emily. "I misjudged you," he admitted, the simplicity of the statement carrying more sincerity than any elaborate apology. Emily held his gaze. "You did not know me," she replied softly. "But you assumed." The distinction was subtle, yet undeniable. A quiet shift moved through the kitchen staff, shoulders straightening, expressions softening. Investors exchanged measured glances, not of scandal, but of evaluation. Daniel extended his hand, not ceremoniously, but respectfully. "If you are willing," he said, voice steady now, "this kitchen would benefit from your presence." Emily looked at the outstretched hand for a moment, then at the staff who had watched everything unfold. She did not reach for recognition. She did not reach for triumph. Instead, she untied her apron slowly and folded it neatly on the counter. "A kitchen should feed more than guests," she said gently. "It should feed respect." The room did not erupt in applause. It did something far more lasting. It remembered. Emily's folded apron rested on the stainless steel counter like a quiet conclusion, but the evening was not finished. The investors remained seated, not out of obligation, but because something more meaningful than a tasting menu had unfolded in front of them. Daniel lowered his extended hand slowly, not rejected, but redirected. He nodded once, absorbing the weight of her decision. "Then perhaps this kitchen needs to change before it deserves you," he said, and for the first time that night, there was no performance in his voice. The livestream camera continued to glow red, carrying the moment far beyond the private dining room, into offices and living rooms where unseen viewers watched the shift in real time. Emily stepped back from the island, but she did not leave. She turned toward the line cooks and servers who had witnessed everything. Her gaze steady, almost protective. "You have skill," she said quietly, addressing them rather than the investors. "Do not let anyone convince you that your value depends on their approval." The words were not dramatic. They were grounded. One of the younger cooks straightened slightly, as if something inside him had been affirmed. Daniel followed her gaze and saw his team differently than he had earlier that evening. Not as extensions of his authority, but as professionals who deserved it. The chairman from Chicago cleared his throat gently. "Chef Whitmore," he said, "culture can be rebuilt. It begins with listening." Daniel inclined his head in acknowledgement. He walked toward the center of the kitchen, not to reclaim it, but to reset it. "Effective immediately," he said evenly. "This kitchen operates on respect. Titles do not excuse arrogance. Skill does not justify humiliation." The staff exchanged uncertain looks, then slow nods. The shift was subtle, but real. Emily watched him for a long moment, evaluating not his words, but his tone. Sincerity cannot be plated like garnish. It must be lived. After a pause, she reached for the folded apron once more. She did not tie it around her waist. Instead, she placed it back on the hook near the prep station. "I do not need a spotlight," she said softly. "I need a kitchen that remembers why it cooks." Daniel met her eyes, and this time he did not attempt to control the narrative. "Then stay," he replied, not as a command, but as an invitation. "Help us remember." The investors watched closely, recognizing that they were witnessing more than culinary talent. They were witnessing character. Emily considered the room one final time, the copper pans, the staff, the investors who had come seeking profit but found perspective. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Not triumph, not surrender, agreement. The tension that had once filled the kitchen dissolved into something steadier, something built not on ego, but on earned respect. Outside, the city lights of Manhattan shimmered against the windows, unaware that inside one restaurant, hierarchy had quietly been replaced with humility. No applause echoed. No dramatic music swelled. Only the steady rhythm of a kitchen preparing to cook again. this time with dignity at its core. And in that warm glow of stainless steel and soft light, everyone understood that excellence without respect is empty, but respect paired with excellence is unforgettable. The kitchen did not return to its usual rhythm immediately. It recalibrated. The investors remained long enough to see the first course of the redesigned service leave the pass under a different atmosphere, one where voices were steady instead of sharp, where corrections were delivered quietly instead of publicly. Daniel stood beside Emily rather than in front of her, observing as she guided a young line cook through adjusting the heat beneath a sauce that threatened to separate. "Lower it by 5 degrees, she said gently. "Let it breathe." The cook nodded, following her instruction, watching the texture return to silk. Daniel noticed the difference. No raised eyebrows. No cutting remarks. Just correction paired with confidence. Word of the evening began to move beyond the private dining room. By the time the final dessert plates were cleared, messages were already circulating through culinary circles, screenshots from the live stream shared across social media, headlines forming in real time. Not about scandal, not about failure, but about transformation. One message read simply, "Michelin star chef chooses humility over ego." Daniel read it quietly on his phone, then set the device down without defensiveness. Across the kitchen, Emily adjusted her sleeves and stepped toward the prep station again, this time not as a test subject, but as a collaborator. She reviewed the upcoming weekend menu, suggesting small refinements, shifting a garnish here, adjusting a timing there. Nothing dramatic, just precise improvements that elevated the whole without diminishing anyone. The staff responded quickly, energized rather than intimidated. The junior server who had earlier whispered in doubt now moved with visible pride. Daniel approached Emily once more, but this time his posture held none of the earlier tension. "Stay on as consulting executive chef," he said quietly. "Not behind the scenes. At the front." Emily considered the offer without haste. She glanced around the kitchen, now buzzing with a steadier energy. "Titles matter less than tone," she replied. "If I stay, it is because this team is ready to grow." Daniel nodded, accepting the condition without negotiation. In the days that followed, Whitmore and Ash became known not only for its refined dishes, but for its culture shift. Staff meetings began with open dialogue. Feedback moved upward as easily as it moved down. Investors noticed the difference in morale, in consistency, in the subtle confidence that translated directly onto every plate. Emily did not seek interviews. She did not schedule press conferences. She arrived early, left late, and talked quietly. Daniel adjusted as well, listening more than speaking, correcting privately rather than publicly. The hierarchy he once defended softened into mentorship. Months later, when a new review described the restaurant as both exceptional and respectful, Daniel read the final line twice. It did not praise technique alone. It praised leadership. He looked across the kitchen where Emily guided another cook through plating with steady hands. She did not look up for applause. She did not need to. In that stainless steel room beneath warm light, something far greater than a single dish had been perfected. It was not power. It was perspective. And everyone who stepped into that kitchen after that night felt it without needing to be told. The quiet revolution had not come through confrontation. It had come through competence, humility, and the simple refusal to let arrogance define excellence. Autumn settled over Manhattan with a quieter kind of brilliance, and inside Whitmore and Ash the transformation that began that night continued to unfold in measured, deliberate ways. The dining room still shimmered under warm light. The copper pans still gleamed. The tasting menu still commanded $300 per guest. But something beneath the surface had changed permanently. Staff meetings now opened with dialogue instead of directives. Line cooks offered suggestions without lowering their eyes. Servers described dishes with pride rooted not in fear of correction, but in understanding of craft. Emily moved through the kitchen without spectacle, reviewing sauces, adjusting seasoning by half a gram, reminding a young pastry chef that sugar could be persuasive without being overwhelming. Daniel observed these moments closely. He noticed how productivity improved when confidence replaced anxiety. He noticed how consistency sharpened when staff felt heard. Investors noticed as well. Quarterly reports reflected not only stable revenue, but rising reservation demand fueled by reviews that described the restaurant as both refined and refreshing. One evening, Months after the live stream that altered everything, a new group of potential partners gathered in the same private dining room. Daniel stood before them again, but his tone had shifted. In this kitchen, he said evenly, precision and respect share the same space. He did not need to emphasize hierarchy. The statement carried strength without dominance. Emily stood nearby, not in the shadows, but not center stage either. When a junior cook accidentally misplated a garnish, Daniel began to step forward instinctively, then paused. Emily simply adjusted the plate gently and offered a quiet explanation. The correction lasted seconds. The lesson lasted longer. The investors watched the exchange carefully, sensing authenticity rather than performance. Later that evening, as the final table departed and the hum of refrigeration replaced the chatter of guests, Daniel approached Emily near the prep counter. "You changed this place," he said, not as flattery, but as acknowledgement. Emily wiped her hands on a clean towel and looked around the kitchen that now felt less rigid, more collaborative. "It changed because it was willing to," she replied softly. Daniel nodded, understanding that willingness had not come from humiliation, but from humility. Outside, the city moved with its usual urgency, unaware that inside one restaurant, excellence had been redefined. Culinary publications began to speak not only of technique, but of culture. Applications to join the kitchen increased, drawn by reputation that extended beyond flavor profiles. The transformation had not erased Daniel's ambition. It refined it. He still pursued stars, accolades, expansion, but he pursued them differently, aware now that recognition without respect hollowed quickly. Emily continued to arrive early, tasting stocks, reviewing sourcing, mentoring quietly. She never requested her Michelin plaque to hang on the wall. She did not need it displayed. The proof was in every steady movement of the staff she guided. And on quiet nights, when the kitchen settled into its rhythm and copper reflected soft light across stainless steel, Daniel would sometimes pause and remember the moment he thought he was proving power. He understood now that true authority does not demand submission. It earns trust. In that understanding, the restaurant found not just success, but substance. Winter arrived quietly in Manhattan, dusting the edges of sidewalks with frost and turning the restaurant windows into mirrors that reflected both the city and the people inside. Nearly a year had passed since the night that reshaped Whitmore and Ash, and the kitchen now moved with a confidence that did not need to be announced. Reservations were booked weeks in advance. Culinary critics returned not to test arrogance, but to experience refinement. Daniel stood near the pass one evening, reviewing a new seasonal dish built around heritage squash and sage brown butter. He tasted it thoughtfully, then glanced at Emily, who watched from a respectful distance rather than hovering. "Too heavy on the finish," he said quietly. Emily nodded. "Let the acidity lead," she replied. He adjusted the balance without hesitation. The exchange was simple, professional, equal. Around them, young cooks worked with focus rather than fear. No one flinched when Daniel approached. No one lowered their voice when offering an idea. The culture shift had matured into something steady and sustainable. One afternoon, a culinary school group toured the kitchen. A student asked Daniel what defined leadership in fine dining. He paused, considering the question more carefully than he might have a year earlier. "Leadership," he said evenly, "is knowing that talent does not need to be tested through humiliation. It needs to be recognized through respect." Emily continued prepping at the counter, but her eyes lifted briefly, acknowledging the change without claiming credit. Later that night, after the final table departed and the lights dimmed to a softer glow, Daniel walked to the center of the kitchen where the emperor's flame had once been used as a weapon of pride. He remembered the confidence that bordered on arrogance, the certainty that power came from control. He also remembered the silence that followed when control slipped away. That silence had not destroyed him. It had corrected him. Emily joined him, reviewing the prep list for the following day. "Do you ever miss Chicago?" he asked quietly. She considered the question, then shook her head gently. "I miss cooking for the right reasons," she said. "And I am doing that now." Daniel nodded, understanding that success measured in stars and revenue had once blinded him to a simpler truth. Skill earns applause. Character earns loyalty. As they locked the doors and stepped into the cold night air, the restaurant behind them stood not as a monument to ego, but as a testament to growth. Inside those stainless steel walls, a lesson had taken root that no investor meeting could manufacture and no award could guarantee. The night he attempted to prove hierarchy, he unknowingly invited humility. And humility, once welcomed, reshaped everything. The city lights shimmered across the glass as snow began to fall again, quiet and steady. In that silence, the kitchen's greatest recipe had revealed itself. Excellence without respect fades quickly, but respect paired with excellence leaves a legacy that no one forgets.